You're in the dark, watching, wanting to look away, but you can't. The hair on the back of your neck stands on its end, and pretty soon, sooner than you think, you're going to scream.
Welcome to Freaky Fandoms. I am Andrew.
And I am Deborah.
And today we are discussing a topic that normally seems to be something I always assume everybody has a pretty good handle on.
But now we are hearing stuff and it's starting to be like, I don't know about that.
Yeah, and it's funny too because we were talking about doing this show days ago. But today, the actual day that we're recording, there was kind of a big storm in the horror community over some controversial comments that really relate to what we're talking about. And it goes back to the old, oh, well, is it really or is it not? And I thought we were done talking about whether or not this qualified. Stop gatekeeping.
Okay, so
yeah.
Cat out of the bag, we're talking about horror as a genre.
Yes, and this is a genre that spans all forms of media. Not just film, so we will be discussing quite a bit.
And we're going to talk about, yes, we understand that horror is kind of discretionary. It's like what some people find scary, other people won't. But at the same time, not everything that is creepy is fucking horror. Yeah,
and the thing about horror as a genre is that it can be objectively defined.
Yes.
It is a top genre right along with comedy, tragedy, basically your drama, action.
Kids movies.
Yeah, and, it's one of those that I always figure people get. I just feel like, of course people know what a horror movie is.
Yeah.
But a lot of people in the community, a lot of the most vocal people especially, seem to have differing opinions of that.
Yeah. So, I guess let's jump into it.
Yeah.
Let's dig in.
Let's talk about a few different things, but what are you thinking?
How long have you been a horror fan, and how did you get into it?
I guess not by choice, but by circumstance.
Yeah.
Because, I've talked about this a few times, especially with you, but also on a couple of other shows, that the first film I ever remember actually seeing was Nightmare 3. And, that's how I got exposed to what a lot of people call kinder trauma. That's how I sort of, got horror embedded into my brain. I was being babysat and somebody put on fucking Dream Warriors, and I'll never forget the dread I felt of Patricia Arquette, her character getting devoured by the Freddy worm, or the Freddy snake as some people call it.
He's the worm.
Yeah. So, it was all about home video for me, and whatever was on cable. And then, my couple of first theatrical experiences, of course, I went and saw a bunch of Disney shit, but I also went and saw Scrooged. And while Scrooged is not a horror film, it has some very horrific and terrifying moments in the movie, especially if it's aimed at the right audience or if the right kind of viewer is watching it. So, I got my taste of horror very early on, and then I started exploring it. And I was lucky because I had tapes around the house, and so did the grandparents. Yeah. So I got to see stuff like The Omen very early.
Yeah.
Which was a great time, and many others. So what about you?
Like I've said before in the past, it kind of came naturally. I very, very early on, I'm talking like 6 years old, every single weekend that we could, my family would go out and we would rent movies, and 9 out of 10 times the movies were almost exclusively horror. I come from a very large family, 3 sisters and a mom and a dad.
Sure.
And somehow all of us randomly would pick different horror movies, and that's just all that we gravitated towards. So it was just that was going to the rental store, and for some reason we always picked horror movies. I can't explain it. And some of the early ones I remember was like Freddy's New Nightmare I was like 6 years old. Wes Craven's New Nightmare, sorry.
Yeah.
That one, I remember watching Poltergeist at a very, very young age. I remember watching like bits of The Exorcist at a very young age. And it was just something that's always been there for me in some way. And on top of that, we also used to tell ghost stories to each other all the time and went on ghost tours and stuff like that. So supernatural stuff was around me all the time.
Yeah, and that's the thing too, is like, my big thing was I was talking about horror movies, but another thing too was that I was an avid reader when I was a kid. And also I loved playing video games.
Yeah.
I grew up where I kind of had to make my own fun a lot of the time. And for me, playing games was a great outlet. I loved the ColecoVision. Some of my favorite games on there were Montezuma's Revenge, which has some horror elements to it and some kind of scary sprites. But of course, it's more a adventure game along the lines of like an Indiana Jones sort of thing. But then books, short stories, I go back to that classic Alfred Hitchcock haunted house book.
In a dark, dark room.
Yeah. Fuck yeah. I used to love going through the library and searching for horror
Scary
books.
stories to tell in the dark.
Yes.
To give you an idea of like just kind of how messed up I was, my little sister and I and one of our good friends, we would actually go, and we lived in England, and not too far from our house, there was an area that was like a ravine that we called the Ditch. And then really close to that was a wooded area that you could very easily get lost in that we called, the Woods.
Nice.
And we would always play in those two areas, and we would recreate or create new scenes, playing it in the ditch and in the woods all the fucking time.
It's fucking morbid.
Yeah, it was great.
Yeah, like I loved watching TV too. A lot of shows that I really enjoyed were ones like Tales from the Crypt, which I was introduced to. One of my first episodes is Four-Sided Triangle, which is the Great Scarecrow episode.
Yeah.
Directed by Tom Holland.
The one that I remember, I think I was like 7 when I saw it, and it fucked me up for years, was the one with David Warner where he's the child psychiatrist and he goes to the house.
Good.
Oh, no, it's not. It's still creepy as fuck.
Yeah, Tangina's in that one too, isn't she?
Is.
And I think Fergie, I believe. But it's so great because, I think what really helped shape my opinion of what horror actually was and give me a clear definition of the genre and just, cement that for me was short stories. Whether they were short stories on paper or short stories on film or presented as a show.
And this is where I'm going to get into this. So another thing was I used to watch the X-Files all the time. X-Files is not horror. X-Files is science fiction that has horror elements. Just because it has horror elements does not mean it is a horror.
Now, talking on X-Files, some of my favorite episodes, and this is just me personally, are the Monster of the Week episodes.
Yes, like the doll episode always got me.
Yeah, and you also love the one with Toombs.
No,
where he
I
crawls
don't.
through all of the air spaces, and it's so great.
Or the one with the invisible monsters in the forest in Florida.
Yeah. The ones that are like chameleon-like. And then for me, the one where it's all of the small glow-in-the-dark mites that cocoon you.
Yeah.
And these are great little horror stories, but they are still capped off by
Science
a
fiction.
supernatural / science fiction / mystery show.
Yes.
There is a very clear definition between what is mystery and what is horror. And as we kind of progress, that line seems to get fuzzier and fuzzier, not just for those two genres, but also for science fiction and horror, for action and horror, for comedy and horror to a degree.
So let's just go ahead and get this cat out of the bag, because
Yeah.
I know we were both aching to talk about it.
Sure.
So what's the name of this stupid movie?
Oh, you want to talk about Annihilation?
Yes.
Specifically? Yeah, so that's the one that's been stirring the pot for a lot of people.
Like, it became a huge thing today
Yeah.
about how the director or CEO or somebody.
Yeah, well, it's one of our favorite publications
Yeah.
that specializes in horror had mentioned that Annihilation was not a horror film, and a lot of people
Are
had
pissed.
a vocal backlash.
And all right, so here's the thing. Annihilation, we watched it, is not a horror movie. It is a science fiction movie that has creepy things that happen in it, but just because it has creepy things does not mean it's a fucking horror movie. It is a science fiction movie with supernatural elements. That's it.
So let's talk a little bit just for a second about the background of why we feel like we have an opinion on this and why we...
Because we watch pretty much nothing but horror movies all the time. And here's the thing. People, I honestly think, are starting to forget what horror really is. They think if it makes them go, then it's horror. No.
Yeah.
It's not.
So the thing about it is that horror, when it comes to a specific piece or a specific work, it's all about the presentation, the overarching theme, the beginning, the ending,
It's
the
the story.
body. If a film starts and ends with horror, or in the case of something like Hitchcock's Psycho, it subverts your expectations and then becomes full-on horror by the end and ends on a horror note. And again, talking about horror, really what it boils down to with horror is a threat to either the person's mind, body, or spirit. So if the threat to someone being death is present, then that can lead to horror, but doesn't always have to. If the threat to someone's sanity is present, that can be the same. And then if someone is completely without hope in a situation that's filled with horrific elements, whether they're tropes or stereotypes or not, those are all qualifiers. But that doesn't mean that every single thing that has those moments in it are, by definition, horror.
And an unpopular opinion that I know we're going to get backlash for it, but it's fucking true. That one black and white movie with the hunter that hunts the kids with Shelley Winters.
Oh, Night of the Hunter.
Night of the Hunter. For some reason, I always it blank. I want to call it something else.
Yeah, with Robert
That is
Mitchum.
not a horror movie.
And I
It
don't...
is a drama
Yeah.
with intimidating circumstances and
A lot of tension.
a lot of tension and threat, but it is not a horror movie.
Yeah, a sense of dread does not make a horror film or a horror story in its entirety. There are many different things that can be presented in any kind of story. There are fucking moments where even Shakespeare included ghosts in his fucking stories.
But Shakespeare's not horror.
Hamlet isn't, Titus is incredibly fucked up, but that's not a horror story, even though it's extremely horrific. There are just all of these misunderstood properties.
I think what gets
that are
me
out there.
the most is when people take a trauma story and say it's horror.
Yeah.
It's like, no, that's emotional, psychological, personal trauma.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean it's horror. That's actually part of, something that people actually go through.
Or like physical trauma.
Yeah.
There are a few movies that come to mind that were very controversial in the 2000s,
Like
especially.
Dolores Claiborne. It's like some people call that horror. It's like, no, that's trauma.
Yeah, that's a very dramatic story that begins with a traumatic and dramatic event and ends with the arc being completed of what that, occurrence was.
Yeah.
But in the case of, these movies that have scary parts that affect some people in scary ways, that's not always going to be what should qualify the film to sit on the horror shelf in the library.
Like Annihilation.
Yeah,
back to
getting
that.
back to that.
People are like, how is it not a horror movie? Didn't you see that bear? And that's their argument.
And the thing is, to me, that is a bit in the film. You know, it's very much a moment in the film that is intentionally placed there to scare and upset the viewer.
But that doesn't mean it's horror.
And it's not even the most horrific moment of the entire film. To me, I think seeing the corpse against the wall,
that was better.
Yeah, because that is an incredibly striking image that gives me a sense of dread. But when you come down to the direct review and look at that film, and this is coming from us as movie reviewers, as cultural study people who, you know, do critique but also really break things down, not to try to gatekeep or to try to tell people that
you're wrong,
you know, anything like that, or to be malicious or negative.
But from our standing viewpoint,
and this is coming from experience and education and, you know, being committed, the film starts and ends with the mystery of what the fuck happened, surrounded by a veil of science fiction, and that, you know, really does qualify it to be that kind of movie. Yes, when some events happen, they're fucked up, but this is a movie where scientists go into a place and they use their skills and they get through what they go through, and then they come out the other end and it's back into that realm where they started, which wasn't from a standpoint of horror.
It was a science fiction mystery.
Yes. And a good comparison to the structure of that for Annihilation is Legend of Hell House.
Yes.
So you look at Legend of Hell House, and this is a story of a few people who go into an environment to do what they do. They're there to study phenomena.
Yes.
It starts from a standpoint of horror. The entire body of the film is filled with horror, and it ends on horror.
Yeah.
You know, it's a completely dedicated ghost story about people who are not where they're supposed to be and are under threat.
Yes.
Mentally and physically. And, you know, not every horror has to be a fucking ghost story.
No.
Not every horror has to be an existential horror or a
monster movie.
Yeah, you know, there are so many subsets and genres of horror, but there are also combined horror films, talking about, you know, horror comedies again, talking about horror kids movies, you know.
Yes, like Watcher in the Woods.
Yeah.
That is a horror movie for kids.
Yes. But talking about another kids movie that has many horrific moments in it, Secret of Nim isn't a fucking horror film.
It just has crazy shit that scarred you for life.
Yeah, it's just terrifying.
But it's not a horror movie.
Yeah, much like even Jurassic Park is not a fucking horror movie.
That's a really good example.
Yeah. So the thing about it is that, you know, we're not trying to tell people how to think or, you know, what to perceive. But the fact of the matter is that when you look at horror as a genre and you look at it from an academic standpoint, from the study of it, it does have very defined parameters.
Yes.
I figure, you know, this is something that just needs to be clarified and it needs to be touched on every now and again. But let's talk about some things from horror movies that really work for us. Do you want to talk about a little bit of Poltergeist? Because, you know, the question about what is the best horror film ever made always gets touted around, but I can never give a good fucking answer.
That's an impossible question to answer.
Yeah.
Or best ghost movie?
Yeah, there's no way.
Yeah, there's no way to be like, that's the best horror movie ever made, because they're so vastly different from each other that it would be unfair.
It's funny talking about the different kinds of horror icons, because it's almost like going into the different kinds of species. of a creature.
You got ghosts, you got goblins, you got vampires, you got werewolves, you got
golems.
you got like psychomaniac killers.
Werewolves.
Yeah, I already said werewolf. So you can't really fairly say, oh, that's the best one.
No, but usually the way I try to approach that question is, what movie is like bubbling at the surface of my brain that I would recommend at the time? And I have a handful of, great horror films that I always pick from.
Yeah.
Hellbound, Hellraiser 2 is always at the top.
Like, I guess for me, it would be like the ones what movies are the ones that you start thinking about it, and just thinking about it makes you have to sleep with the lights on.
Yeah, there
And
are a few of those.
I have two. One of them's newer, and one of them is easy, but all right, so the Babadook, I know people like, that movie wasn't scary. Fucked me up. I mean, I had to sleep with the nightlight on for 3 months. And 2 weeks of those 3 months, it wasn't a nightlight. It was the overhead light in the bedroom. It was that bad. The other one is Poltergeist. All I have to do is think about the scene where they're all together in the living room whispering, and for some reason, it just gives me the creeps.
Yeah, that's a thing about both of those two films. Those are clearly horror films.
Yes.
They are, in all their entirety, that genre. Poltergeist is just so universally beloved by people.
Yeah, it's easy.
It really is, but the thing is that it's also so fucking effective, and it's so goddamn special.
I still can't watch it without getting messed up. I can't.
It is perfect fucking lightning in a bottle, not only from the story and the direction and the basic building blocks of filmmaking. It's one of those that it shouldn't fucking exist.
No, it
because
shouldn't.
It's so goddamn good.
And it's cursed.
Yeah, it's cursed as fuck. That's the thing too, it's always interesting to look at horror films that are by definition direct horror, and then occasionally see that bad shit happened to the people who made them.
Yeah.
The Omen is one of the most notorious, which is incredible. Poltergeist, definitely too. The whole Poltergeist series, in fact.
People, no, it was bad. It was bad all around.
Yeah, there's a lot to get into, and we might do that as an entire show. But, I think of movies like The Blob remake, which is a really fun horror movie, but it's still legitimately horror. I think Night of the Creeps is still a horror movie. Creature
of the Black Lagoon is still a horror movie.
Oh, you want to talk about some of the Universal monsters?
They started it.
Yeah.
Well, no, actually what started it was Phantom of the Opera in 1923.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that came from the...
even in silent era. See, that's the thing. Even in, black and white silent era, they knew what horror was. They didn't mix anything into it.
It kind of, for the theatrical stuff and what led to film, there's a lot of what is, said out there about, and I always feel like I'm fucking up the name of this French theater troupe, but it's the Grand Guignol.
Okay.
In the late 1800s and the early 1900s, they were putting on the plays that basically were these violent representations of horror stories and slasher stories and things that were inspired by medieval times and what was going on.
Biblical stuff. And,
and, ghost stories, vampire stories, other things like that. And it's basically what winds up in Vampire Interview with a Vampire.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, that is kind of a core for the performance of, it becoming bigger and bigger and getting an audience. But
horror has always been around.
There's never been a time that it hasn't existed.
Yeah.
There's always been fear.
Even parts of Don Giovanni.
Oh, God, yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Because, it gets to the point where...
It's not horror, but there are horrific bits.
Yeah.
But no, horror stories date back as far as you can go.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we were always doing horror.
Yeah, and, it's a big part due to government, church, and people trying to oppress others. And it's funny, we were just talking about Haxan, and going back to what was going on in the 1500s and the 1400s, the witch trials and the Inquisition and everything that was happening to fucking poor people.
Yeah.
Created some of the most horrific stories ever told. And they came from the mouths of people who were being fucking tortured.
Yeah.
Who were saying that, me and a group of friends bewitched this family because they made fun of us in the street, and the way that we did it was we pulled body parts off of corpses in the gallows to be able to create potions to curse them.
Yeah.
And poison them. And then that gets passed down, and that gets translated, and it winds up
being told at bedtime to scare your kids.
Yeah, to, try to keep them in a good mindset of not always being terrified of everything, but also being prepared. And I think something about horror that always has appealed to me is that horror shows you the worst of what could happen.
Yeah.
And that's, even in like a paranormal story. You see, these people did something that they weren't supposed to. They opened the wrong tomb. They fucked with the wrong Ouija board. Mm-hmm. Bad shit's happening. Don't do that.
You shouldn't do that. That's not a smart idea.
Yeah.
Don't mess with Ouija boards. It's common fucking sense.
I love stories like that are like almost, on the level with things like Aesop's Fables, where it's really just kind of a tale that is told to kids and told around groups.
To learn something.
Yeah, to not fuck around where you shouldn't be fucking around.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, I love the horror genre. I love studying horror. I love seeing what people bring to the table when they're talking about horror.
What I like a lot about it is what it reveals about a person. I feel like if you can learn a lot about a person based on what horror really affects them. So, like, for instance, like, I'm terrified of ghost movies. I'm afraid of the unknown. I'm afraid of not knowing what's happening and what's there.
Sure.
Killer movies. You're afraid of people around you and not knowing what someone's going to do to you.
Yeah.
So it's just stuff like that. I like what it can reveal about a person's fears.
Yeah, it can be a psychological study, for
and it's
sure.
also fun. It gets the adrenaline going, and it's great.
Well, I love haunted houses. Like, we've talked about this. We've been to tons.
I know.
And we've had incredible experiences, but also terrifying experiences.
Like that time where I literally stopped and was paralyzed and could not move, and I kept looking down and had to be dragged out because I could not do it anymore.
Which was hilarious because that happened in a Silent Hill haunted house.
It did not. It happened in that creepy Tallman one.
That's right. You did seize up in that one and didn't move.
No, what happened in Silent Hill was
You just locked up and put your head under my shoulder.
No, I was perfectly fine. And then we got to the clown bit, and someone came up behind me and screamed in my ear and made my hair move, and I started crying. Because it was right behind me, and I didn't see him, and I just hear, and my hair moves, and I'm like, ah! And just couldn't stop.
But it was thrilling and exciting and hilarious and fun. And, horror can be like that when you experience it, when you're enjoying it. It can be a good time. You don't always have to be fucked up
No.
by watching a horror movie.
There are so many times that you and I are chilling on the couch watching a horror movie and going, "Ha!"
Yeah, we're just laughing our asses off at like how certain effects
It's
are pulled
actually
off, some kills.
a lot more than I would expect.
Well, there are some movies that are played a little bit tongue-in-cheek. And I think one thing that's really interesting about it, too, is I've sort of adopted this a lot more since you told me about your conversation with him. But it was Ted Raimi who gave you some really important insight into how he approaches horror.
Meeting him was so great.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I asked him that Andrew's referring to is I asked him, like, how hard is it for you to separate what you do in horror movies and what you do in a comedy role? And he said, it's not, because they're the same thing. Mm-hmm. It's the same facial expression and the same amount of effort to laugh as it is to scream.
Yeah. And that doesn't mean that every horror movie is a comedy. What it means is by a seasoned and experienced actor who is versed in the technique and the craft, he knows what the fuck he's doing.
And you can kind of like embrace it more and you can accept it more and not be so scared.
Yeah. You don't have to be terrified all the time, but it's also, the thing where someone is screaming and they could be screaming out of laughter and joy and hilarity and madness, or they could be screaming out of insanity and being terrified and horror and everything else. It's like real actual work from a performer.
Yeah.
But it's also perspective. Mm-hmm. So it's really fascinating that, they're so linked in that way.
They are.
And I love that shit. I absolutely love just looking at it from that angle because they're both really important to storytelling.
Yeah.
And they both invoke a response. Some movies are funny as fuck. Some movies are scary as fuck. Mm-hmm. And I think that with him, I've always found him to be a fascinating actor, and it was even crazier
seeing him in Skinner,
because I had no idea he pushed shit that far.
That's a horror movie.
That is a fucking horror movie. It is fucked up. It really is. It is horrific and disturbing, and it's a film. It's a film worth seeing.
I was not expecting that.
Yeah. Well,
And then we watch something like Housewife.
Yeah.
And it's like, while it had horrific things and it was crazy.
Sure.
I didn't think it was horror.
It really did have a lot more of a dramatic tone to it.
With grotesque imagery.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's what that was for me.
When you look at...
It was good.
I think it was good too.
And then you look at Baskin. That's a horror movie.
Yes. And again, it goes back to the people being in a place that they shouldn't be and getting fucking destroyed.
Yeah.
That's one, form of the stories that can be told. And, it's definitely even that way with some of the classics from the 70s and 80s and things along those lines. I mean, you look at something like Dawn of the Dead, which we might be talking about and doing a full episode on. It starts off and it feels like a war movie, a siege movie, state of emergency movie, which it is. And there's a lot of gunfire, there's a lot of, insanity, and then the horror presence shows up and it stays with the entire film.
Going back to it, Creature of the Black Lagoon, it starts off as a research movie.
It's an expedition film.
It's an expedition. And then, you shouldn't be here. And there's this prehistoric creature who's going to mess you up.
Yeah.
Because you're messing up his home. You're in the wrong place.
And the thing about, Creature from the Black Lagoon is that it ends with the creature being the most important aspect of the story.
Yeah.
And the horror of that creature being the focus.
It's also the best Universal. Just saying.
You don't want to give it to Larry Talbot. You don't want to let him have the win with his wolf cane. It's got a star on it. It's
Creature of the Black
earrings in the
Lagoon
windows.
is the best Universal monster.
See, the thing is like the Universal monster movies, they're an interesting mixed bag because they define all of the classic monsters.
Yeah.
From
Invisible
that era.
Man and
I was going to talk about that, is that the Invisible Man is just so fucking funny.
it is. It's hilarious.
It's an incredible comedy. And I love that movie. And I still categorize it as a horror movie to a degree, but I think it's one of the first like genuine good horror comedies that opened the door for stuff like Abbott and Costello, and then you start looking at, more and more
But those
films.
are comedy movies that have monsters in them. It's not a horror movie.
Exactly. Just because monsters show up doesn't mean your film is horror.
Yeah.
And we really look out for more new horror each year.
All the time.
There are some that get put on a pedestal and they deliver and they're fucking fantastic. Like
Hereditary.
The Witch. Hereditary. Yes, exactly. That is bar none, in my opinion.
The
and I
best
think yours
one of
too.
2018.
Hands down. Hands fucking down. That movie was so good. And people argue about it. And people get upset because people say, oh, no, it's not a horror movie. And I thought we were done talking about what is and what isn't a horror movie.
Well, no, that's just the... I think that's what this comes down to. We're never going to be done arguing over what is and what isn't a horror movie because it's different for everybody.
Yeah. And I feel like when you look at the genre and what it is fully, and you study it and you respect it, and you're not just trying to get on the bandwagon to get attention.
Can I also just say that people who are saying Hereditary is not a horror movie are people who watch nothing but the Conjuring and Insidious movies?
Yeah, that's part of it. And those films, they do well.
Yeah, they do well.
They're very manufactured and specifically engineered to get people interested, and that's the thing too.
But the thing is people are getting bored with those now too because it's just over and over and over and over manufactured horror.
Yeah,
to the point where it's like they're getting bored with it. But I've noticed that it's kind of harder for them to see a real horror movie and be like, oh, this is boring. It's like it's because you're not jumping because you're being forced to jump. You have to think.
Yeah, there's a thing that's been going on since the beginning of film and film distribution, and it's all about the sales. And what's popular comes in waves. Mm-hmm. Right now, we're seeing a bit of what people are calling a horror renaissance. We're getting a lot more witchcraft and supernatural films, and that's fun. And they're kind of coming off of the tail end of the big boom of the Paranormal Activity era.
Yeah.
Where the house is haunted and it's coming off of the found footage stuff. For a while, there was the horror wave that was coming out of France. There was the huge boom of Japanese horror films.
Which was one of my favorite booms.
Yeah.
I loved the Japanese horror movie boom.
And that came right after the big 90s teenage slasher wave. And then right before that, it just goes back and back and back to the 80s slasher movies and the 70s exploitation movies and then the Universal Monsters movies and, the era of the atomic age monster giant.
There is a popular
ants and shit.
There's a popular version of horror all the time.
Yeah, and it lasts like 5 to 7 years.
But what I'm really getting tired of is people watching movies now and calling it horror when it isn't.
Right. And
when it is, be like, no, it's not horror, it's not scary. It's like,
I think that's just the I don't know, the way that popular opinion is right now, and the
Yeah.
fact that everyone is a critic and everyone feels like they have an opinion worth sharing and a review to post.
And I'm gonna be a bitch. Sorry guys, but I'm gonna be a bitch, and you can counter my opinion if you want. I don't care. Just because it's an artsy movie doesn't mean it's a horror movie. That's another one I've been noticing. Oh, it's artsy. It's making you think it's doing this, like, and people either put it into the drama or horror box, and it's like, what?
It could just be avant-garde. It could just be...
Because I've been hearing people say that Mother was a horror movie. Like,
yeah.
no. Mother
Yeah.
was not a horror movie. Mother was a fucking egotistical trip.
Yeah.
Power trip. It was fucking stupid. Hated that movie. God damn.
There are a lot of people who are very, very vocal out there, and a lot of people who are just trying to get their name heard or read. And it's kind of a real shitty deal that they're coming from an uneducated stance and they're misleading people. And they're trying to gather...
Well, we can't say that for sure, because maybe they went to college for it.
And, fair enough. I mean, that's fine.
But I think where we're coming on is we study movies. We study entertainment of all forms. And we are avid fans about it. Because, like I said, we watch almost exclusively horror. It's like it's more of a lifestyle for us. And that's why we're so protective and defensive about it, because it is such of a lifestyle for us.
Yeah, and it's not that I'm, trying to be protective and defensive of my opinion. It's that I'm trying to draw the line for the genre.
Yes.
To say that, yes, it can be a part of other things, but when you look at its core, it's that fucking diamond that does not need to be chipped away at to benefit your own opinion.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's like, you can attack our opinions all you want. I don't care. But where we're coming from is like, no, this is what we believe horror is, and we don't want that to get messed up.
Yeah, we don't want, basically, when everything is considered horror, nothing is horror.
Yeah.
And if horror loses what its real intent is, then we lose an important genre
of
that
storytelling and
positively affects people
and
too.
Morals.
Yeah.
Like, they're stories to teach you morals and lessons. And if we lose that, then that's really sad.
Yeah, and we want to preserve that. So this is kind of a talk of, really think about what horror is. Take our opinions, take our thoughts, take our, facts based on history and study and everything that we presented, and just think for yourself about horror and what you're reading, what you're listening to, what you're watching, and just remember that, this is one of our most beloved genres out there.
Yeah.
And it absolutely deserves to be preserved, much like any great art piece in a museum. Mm-hmm. Or massive library or any wonder of the world or anything like that.
And we can keep talking about this for hours.
Well,
we can talk about how we were playing the friggin' Trivial Pursuit Horror Edition for the zillionth time, and we kept coming across things, and we're like, but that's not a horror movie.
Yeah. But it's popular, so it wound up in the game.
Yeah.
Even though the fucking answers are wrong.
Which we, actually proved to Trivial Pursuit that...
Yeah, we called USAopoly.
Yeah, and we're like, hey, this is wrong, and gave them proof. And they're like, oh, shit, so when we reprint it, we're just going to have to change that answer because it was wrong.
I hate to dime them out, but the perspective that I got was, well, we already made our money off the game, so why would we fix it now? But thanks for calling. So, yeah, folks, don't believe the rumor that if you ever call up Trivial Pursuit and
you
let them
get
know,
money. It's not true.
or, something or whatever. I don't know. But I think we've made our point. We've talked about horror marathons, we've talked about horror films, we've talked about horror properties and games on the show, and we're going to keep doing that. But of course, this isn't just the Freaky Fandoms horror show with Andrew and Deborah. This is a culture study show and a very, variety-based type of discussion platform. But I will say we do have a fun Kinder Trauma episode coming up soon with a guest.
That'd be nice.
And that'll be a lot of fun.
We also have a very, very left field episode in the works.
Yeah.
Which I don't know how you guys are going to take it.
Oh, man. Well, the thing is that
because I think we're changing it because of the announcement that you showed me the other week.
That's right. Are we bumping it up?
I don't know if we're bumping it up, but the subject might change.
Okay. Fair enough. Well, we'll figure that out when we get there.
It would be the same subject, but a different part of that subject, if that makes sense.
Right. Well, folks, thanks for listening to another Freaky Fandoms. Thanks for joining us with this discussion. As always, hit us up in any of our comments on any of our feeds or any of our posts about your thoughts on horror as a genre, your thoughts on the horror community, your thoughts on people who are trying to divide others between this is horror, this isn't horror.
Or if you're fed up about hearing about it, we want to hear that too.
Yeah, if you're tired of the debate and you feel like you've got a good handle on the genre, or you just don't give a fuck, let us know, and we'll have that talk.
Also, feel free to comment something that you're a freaky fan of that you would like for us to cover. It's always good to have new ideas and materials to discuss, and maybe you're going to tell us about something that we haven't seen before or read or experienced, and it will be something new for us, and we'll be able to do that too.
Hell yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, and we got a new Patreon.
Yes. So on our Patreon feed, we recently got a new patron, and we're extremely happy because we have done so much great work with these guys and we love them. We are now sponsored also by 26 Movies from Hell and 4 Brains 1 Movie and Dinner with Lynch, Bradley J. Cornish and Dan Pullen. Yeah, it's great. So guys, thank you so much for sponsoring the show. And as always, thank you to all of our patrons, all of our subscribers and followers. We love you guys. You help us keep bringing a good show every week, helping us get all of our materials together every single time we want to unleash another one of these on the world.
Yeah. Also, big shout out to American McGee and Martin working on Alice Asylum. I know they're a little bit busy. I think
Pirate Jam.
Yeah.
Yeah.
American's doing Pirate Jam out in Thailand right now, so he's sailing on a sailboat and making little games on his computer and doing all kinds of programming stuff with a whole bunch of other people.
Well, he's location scouting right now.
Yeah.
And
he's doing that too.
Yeah, he's actually been announcing, and some of the other game developers have been saying that they're going to be involved in Pirate Jam 2019. So
that's awesome.
More fun stuff to look forward to soon.
Yeah, he's doing Pirate Jam right now, but he will be back doing more work on Alice. Yeah.
Can't wait.
It's shaping up to be so good.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to the next stream too, because they're gonna have a lot to talk about.
They're gonna have a lot of new art. I'm sure they're gonna have a lot of art. They're gonna have a lot of news, and I can't wait. And American and Martin are always so kind and give us little shout outs.
Mm-hmm. We love them.
They support us. We support them. And just go check them out. It's a circle. It's like it's a community. Go give them some love.
Yes. And a big shout out to one of our favorite folks, Chet Zar, over at the Dark Art Society podcast, who just celebrated his 100th episode.
Congratulations!
Yes, with the artist and author Brahm, which is so fucking
crazy.
Cool. So congrats, Chet. Congrats to the Dark Art Society. And other than that, I think we're ready to wrap shout-outs for today. Although I did have a couple of really good appearances on 26 Movies from Hell, talking about hacks and other stuff.
You've been been busy
Yeah,
with
yeah.
26 movies from Hell / 4 Brains 1 movie. You've been insane with those guys.
We've got some good stuff coming up with those guys too, because
Yeah.
we've got La Chiesa to look forward to. Mm-hmm. So keep tracking us on all of the
I kind of
feeds,
actually
folks.
want to say that too. If there's
Yeah, go
ever
ahead.
a week that we don't have an episode,
Hmm.
it's usually because we're working with 4
those
Brains 1
guys?
movies.
Yeah.
So, you might want to listen to it because that would be a way for you to be like, oh, I don't have Freaky Fandoms this week. Guess what? You do, actually.
Yeah, and we do post all of those on our Patreon.
Yeah.
So if you want to keep track there, we're sharing that every time we appear. But other than that, folks, I think we're ready to wrap this one up.
Yeah.
All about horror. What do you think?
I think it's been a good talk. Like I said, we can do a lot more with it.
Yeah.
But I like that we talked about a genre and a little bit more of culture
And the community.
things in the community.
Yeah, I really wanted to talk about horror fans today and the divide that's going on, but the fact that, it's a real genre that people should have a firm grasp on is the whole focus.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's been a good talk.
Yeah. And we've been Freaky Fandoms.
Yep. It's Freaky Fandoms.
Woo!